Double, double toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble. Cool it with a baboon's blood, then the charm is firm and good. Shakespeare's weird sisters predicted the rise of Macbeth and then predicted his downfall. He drew them from source material, but they also might have been inspired by King James, who was obsessed with witches and hunting them. And in that, King James was not alone. Hunting witches was also quite popular on the continent as well. The European witch trials of the early modern period are history that deserve to be remembered. In 1589, King James VI of Scotland married Princess Anne of Denmark via proxy, with James's representative standing in during the ceremony. Anne then sailed for Scotland, but encountered storms on the seas and was forced to seek refuge in Norway. After calling for prayers and fasting, James went to Norway, where he formally married her at the Oslo Palace. They celebrated throughout Europe and went back to Scotland in 1590. James, however, remained haunted by Anne's problems at sea and placed the blame on Scottish witches. He didn't create this out of nowhere. The admiral of the Danish fleet escorting Anne blamed the wife of an official in Copenhagen, whom he had insulted. In Scotland, several nobles were eventually implicated, and in Denmark, witchcraft trials were held. During the Danish trials, one woman, Anna Coldings, gave the name of 5 other women, one of whom was the official's wife that was suspected by the admiral. The 5 others confessed that they summoned the storms by sorcery. 2 women were burned at the stake. Back in Scotland, James heard of the Danish trials and set up his own inquiry. The episode became known as the North Berwick Witch Trials. In the Middle Ages and even into the Renaissance, ritual folk magic and medicine was practiced throughout Europe, mostly by women in the villages. Because medicine did not yet exist as a profession, people sought out the local wise woman for healing. In Britain, they were referred to as cunning folk, who provided a variety of services to their communities. First, they provided help against malevolent witchcraft, which had been practiced against the person seeking their assistance. They would use charms, rituals, and herbs to relieve the person. Second, they employed a variety of methods to find lost property and criminals. Third, they were sought after to provide healing through potions and herbs, but also rituals and prayers. Historian Owen Davies notes that cunning folk were seen as helpful and useful, while witches were seen as evil. In 1200, the Catholic Church adopted the doctrine that witches obtained supernatural powers through collaboration with demons and devils. Cunning folks were sometimes not caught up in the witchcraft accusations because the locals did not see them as evil, but witch hunters wanted to prosecute them as well as witches. During the North Berwick witch hunts, more than 100 suspected witches were arrested. Many were tortured by James's inquisitors. Under torture, they confessed having met with the devil at night in St. Andrew's Kirk on the Green in North Berwick, and used their powers to attempt to sink the king's ship. James believed one of the accused because she told him something he had only told his wife in private. She must have attained this knowledge supernaturally, he reasoned, ignoring the most plausible explanation that she had learned it from a chambermaid who either overheard it or was told it by Anne. Among the accused were Gaelish Duncan and Agnes Sampson. Duncan was a healer and Sampson was a midwife. Gaelish's boss was the deputy bailiff to the Kingdom of Scotland, but when she became a healer in a short period of time, community members suspected her of witchcraft. After being tortured, Duncan and Sampson named accomplices and confessed. Agnes Thompson, one of their accomplices, confessed to King James himself that she used witchcraft to attempt to kill him, thus making her guilty of attempted regicide as well as witchcraft. The North Berwick witches were burned at the stake. In 1597, James published Demonology, his treatise on black magic. James changed evidence laws to make his trials easier, such as allowing the testimony of children, which had previously been banned. James did not give up on his obsession with the dark arts, even as he became King of England in 1603 upon the death of Queen Elizabeth I. In 1563, Queen Elizabeth I's Parliament had criminalized witchcraft with an Act Against Conjurations, Enchantments, and Witchcrafts. Following the passage of the Act, indictments for homicide caused by witchcraft began to appear in the historical record. More than 1 in 5 indictments for murder in the period following the passage of the Act were attributed to witchcraft, and only 5% of those accused of murder by witchcraft were men. But the 1563 Act only demanded the death penalty for practicing witchcraft if physical harm was caused. Lesser crimes of witchcraft were punishable by imprisonment. The Act passed in 1604 after James's ascension, an Act Against Conjuration, Witchcraft, and Dealing with Evil and Wicked Spirits, expanded the definition to bring the death penalty to anyone who invoked evil spirits or communed with familiar spirits. In 1612, the Pendle witches were tried. 9 people were hung for witchcraft on the testimony of a 9-year-old girl. In all, 10 people were executed as a result of the Pendle Witch Trials. An account of the trials called The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancaster was published by Thomas Potts, clerk of the court. In 1629, Richard Bernard wrote a manual on witch hunting. A guide to grand jurymen advises those participating in trials how to evaluate evidence and avoid being deceived by false accusations. His manual was meant to reform witchcraft laws by seeking direct evidence. Witch hysteria did not die with King James. His son, King Charles I, reformed the law to require material proof of witchcraft. Witch hunters thus began trying to gather the needed evidence. During the English Civil War, Matthew Hopkins's witch-hunting career flourished. He began hunting witches in 1644, and he was responsible, along with his associates, for more people being hanged for witchcraft in England than had been in the previous 100 years. He proclaimed himself Witchfinder General. According to Hopkins' book, The Discovery of Witches, he began his career after overhearing women discuss meeting with the devil. Joined by John Stern, Hopkins tried to prove accused witches made a contract with the devil, which is what made them guilty of heresy and reduced their legal rights. They often used sleep deprivation to extract confessions. They also used various tests, such as cutting the arm of the accused, and if they did not bleed, they were a witch. Another was the swimming test, where if a person floated, they were guilty of witchcraft because the water was rejecting them because they rejected their Christian baptism. They also looked for the devil's mark, a third nipple, or a mole. His book outlined such methods and was recommended in law books. In 1648, they were adopted by the colonists in Connecticut while trying Alice Young and Margaret Jones. Jones's execution was the first in the witch hunt in the colonies that lasted from 1643 to 1663. Hopkins' methods were utilized in the Salem Witch Trials years later in 1692 to 1693. During that episode, 19 were executed for witchcraft and 150 imprisoned. The testimony of children, first allowed by James, was also vital to the trials. The British witch trials were not an aberration in Europe. They were part of a widespread witch hysteria occurring throughout the continent. In 1486, the Malus Maleficarium by Heinrich Kramer advocated extermination of witches amid a detailed legal and theological theory. It endorsed torture and deception to get confessions. It also developed a gender-based theory, stating that women were more susceptible to demonic temptations and more carnal than men. Some historians note that most of the victims were outspoken women who defied social conventions of the time. Others theorize that since Europe was transitioning from feudalism to capitalism, women's economic competition threatened men of the time. The peak of European witch trials occurred between 1560 and 1630. Between 1580 to 1630, an estimated 50,000 Europeans were burned at the stake for the crime of witchcraft. About 80% of them were women. Between 1560 and 1707, as many as 4,000 witches may have been killed in Scotland alone. The numbers are only estimates because the records at the time are not exact and sometimes missing. In general, there was a regional divide in witch hunting. In continental Europe, there were more trials in France and the Holy Roman Empire than in Italy and Spain. In the British Isles, Ireland had few trials compared to Scotland and England. The epicenter of European witch hysteria was the German-speaking heartland, Switzerland and northern European German-speaking states. Germany had the most witch trials, over 1,000 between 1626 and 1631 alone. At least 368 and possibly as many as 1,000 people were executed as a result of the 1581 to 1593 witch trials in Trier, Germany, arguably the biggest mass execution in European history during peacetime. Witch trials also resulted in the execution of hundreds in Fulda, Würzburg, and Bamberg. Germany was responsible for 42% of all the European witch trials, followed by Switzerland and France. Protestants were more wary of witchcraft than Catholics. Catholicism had traditionally viewed charges of witchcraft with skepticism, as the mere belief in the existence of supernatural phenomena was considered heretical. Old customs, such as hunting witches, were viewed as being as dangerous to Catholic orthodoxy as witchcraft. Even confessions were viewed with skepticism, since the word of witches was not to be trusted. Still, the Spanish Inquisition investigated some 7,000 people for purported witchcraft in the 17th century, and at least 12 women were burned at the stake. The pursuit of witches grew as the Reformation in Germany and England picked up. Witch trials were more frequent in Germany and Switzerland, where conflicts between Protestants and Catholics were most heated. Some historians place the blame for these prosecutions on natural and economic disasters. It was easy to blame witches for crop failures, climate changes, economic collapse, and disease. Others also note that an increase in unmarried women, displacement of nuns closing convents in the Reformation, and decline in economic opportunity may have driven persecution of women as witches. The Enlightenment eventually brought an end to the witch hysteria and prosecutions that had inspired the weird women in Shakespeare's Macbeth. In 1735, English witchcraft law was amended to make it against the law to accuse someone else of having supernatural powers or of using witchcraft, and that finally put an end to the witch hysteria that had been so prevalent in Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries. Most Americans are familiar with the Salem Witch Trials, which occurred in the American colonies in the 1690s, but the European witch trials and witch hunts of the early modern period are relatively more forgotten. But those set the stage for what happened here in America. Child testimony, the methods for identifying witches, methods for extracting testimony, those are all processes which had been defined in Europe 90 years before the Salem trials. And of course, all of that gave rise to the more modern term, witch hunt. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.